Welcome to the Human Momentum Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Schabert. I created this podcast to leverage 12 years of osteopathic medical training and over a decade of experience in primary care medicine to help sort through the confusing and often contradictory health information found on the internet. I want to distill all this information down into a form that you can use every day to optimize your health as you move forward through life. So if you are looking to get to life's finish line with the ability to do all the things that you love intact, then this podcast is for you. If this is your first time here, please don't forget to smash the subscribe button and throw us a like as well. I'd also love it if you would share this episode with people in your life who you believe can benefit from it. It really helps us get this information out to more people. With all that said, let's move on with today's episode. Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the Human Momentum Podcast. Today, I want to make yet another attempt to look at a video that was produced on another channel and react to it and use that as an example to start to try and teach you, my audience, how to make sense of a lot of contradictory information that's out there. One of the things that I see frequently in medically related content that is produced on other channels is that there are inaccuracies created by being definitive about science that is still unsettled as of today. And today's episode is going to be a perfect example of exactly that. I'm going to be looking at an interview that a Dr. Robert Lustig did on the Diary of the CEO channel this past fall. In this interview, he talked about a lot of issues relating to chronic disease and health risks. Now, Dr. Lustig is a prominent endocrinologist. He is obviously very knowledgeable, and most of what he says in this interview is quite correct. And where he gets off the rails a little bit is in trying to be definitive on scientific issues that aren't entirely settled, particularly when you start looking at Alzheimer's and nutrition. There are a couple clips from that rather long interview that I'm going to delve into and try and illustrate where I think he's right and where I think he's wrong. And when he is incorrect, where it's almost entirely a case where he is making a definitive statement about something that needs a little bit more nuance. So to begin with, we have a clip we're going to review here where he talks about what is happening with the incidence of Alzheimer's and what he thinks is causing it.
I mean, that's what we're seeing in the United States. Over 7 million Americans live with Alzheimer's, and this is expected to double to almost 13 million in the coming decades.
Indeed. Because we haven't solved the problem.
That's the mechanism. What is the cause?
Right. So we know that the cause is environmental. Now, people say, oh, Alzheimer's is genetic. Garbage. There is a genetic component to Alzheimer's. I'm not arguing that. There is. Okay? This is a thing called ApoE4. And if you have 2 copies of ApoE4 on your genome, your risk for getting Alzheimer's is 9 times the general population. That is absolutely true. I don't disagree with that. So ApoE4 is not a good thing. I'm not arguing that. Once upon a time in, evolution, having 2 copies of ApoE4 was good because it meant you got fat up to your brain pretty fast. But we don't need that right now. That's kind of an old news kind of issue. People who have double doses of ApoE4 are at higher risk. There is absolutely no question about that. But they can mitigate that risk if they change their diet. Okay? They can eat a very low-fat diet and improve their risk down to the general population. Okay? Everything else in Alzheimer's is not genetic. By the way, that genetic component is only 5% of all Alzheimer's. So that means 95% of Alzheimer's risk is environmental.
So let's talk about that clip a little bit. I think the point that Dr. Lustig is really attempting to make is that although there is a genetic component of Alzheimer's, that there's definitely something going on environmentally that is increasing the incidence of Alzheimer's. But he doesn't state this very well, saying that the idea that Alzheimer's is genetic is garbage and that only 5% of Alzheimer's is due to genetics is not consistent with the science at all. First off, I'm not sure where he got that 5% number for sure, but 5% of Alzheimer's is early onset, and we do believe that early onset Alzheimer's is overwhelmingly due to genetic risk. Also, around 3 to 5% of the population has two copies of the ApoE4 gene variant that he mentions. This does increase Alzheimer's risk by 9 times, as he said. Now, the problem with this is not everyone with two copies of ApoE4 will go on to develop Alzheimer's. Additionally, people who have one copy of the ApoE4 gene constitute 25% or so of the population in the US, and they have 2 to 3 times increased risk of developing Alzheimer's. This obviously pushes the genetic component of Alzheimer's above that 5% margin that he mentions. Not to mention, we do believe there's other genetic risks that we haven't identified yet. Sibling and twin studies from Scandinavia, particularly, have shown that even when those two individuals that are siblings or twins are raised in different households with very different lifestyles, there tends to still be a greatly increased risk of Alzheimer's in the other sibling or the other twin when one of them gets it. The risk between identical twins is extremely high if one of them gets it, even if one has a much healthier lifestyle than the other and avoids a lot of the exposures that Dr. Lustig mentions later when he is attempting to determine what's causative. All right. Now, despite that, Stephen Bartlett mentions the increasing incidence of Alzheimer's that we have seen in recent years and how much it's expected to increase in the future, which is by as much as 2 times. Obviously, genetics aren't changing that rapidly. So there is an environmental component or set of environmental components that is driving this increase. We're going to get into what Dr. Lustig attributes this to and what I think about that causative attribution a little bit later in this video. Matter of fact, quite shortly. One of the things he attributes this increase to are the consumption of artificial sweeteners, non-nutritive sweeteners, things like aspartame and sucralose particularly. Let's watch this clip and I'll get into a little bit of what I think about that.
A paper just came out like 3 days ago in Annals of Neurology, basically showing that non-nutritive sweetener consumption, so diet sweetener consumption, correlates with dementia. And we think we know why.
Why?
Reactive oxygen species, so oxygen radicals, little chemicals that are given off from various substances that cause changes in energy metabolism in cells and also cause damage in cells. ROSs, reactive oxygen species. The famous ones are aspartame and sucralose. Now, do monk fruit extract, do stevia, does allulose also cause reactive oxygen species? I very specifically looked for data on those, could not find it. But for aspartame and for sucralose, the two biggest ones that are available today, the ones that are used in a lot of diet drinks, huge amounts of ROS generation.
ROS.
So, reactive oxygen species generation. So anything that generates ROSs contributes to dementia.
Is the evidence strong at this stage?
Yeah, it's pretty darn strong. I'm actually giving a talk about this next week in San Diego.
In that clip, what I think Dr. Lustig is attempting to say is that he attributes the ever-increasing incidence of Alzheimer's to the consumption of artificial sweeteners like sucralose and aspartame particularly. He is stating that there is research that these non-nutritive sweeteners will increase levels of something called reactive oxygen species in the brain, and that these will cause the kind of damage to neurons that we see in Alzheimer's with the formation of amyloid plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, and eventually neuronal cell death. And this is due to issues with energy metabolism that occur because of these reactive oxygen species. Now, let's be clear, there is animal research that is very suggestive that this may be true. However, we have not seen definitive evidence in human studies yet to think this is the case. We have to look back at the history of Alzheimer's disease because in it, we can see a ready example of why jumping to this sort of conclusion can lead us down the wrong path. For decades, we looked at early mechanistic evidence that seemed to prove that the formation of amyloid plaques led to the formation of neurofibrillary tangles, and that this would lead to the inability of neurons to communicate normally and eventually would lead to neurons dying, that is, nerve cell death, and the kind of brain atrophy or the wasting away of the brain that we see in Alzheimer's. And because of it, we pursued medications that could clear amyloid buildup. And we thought by clearing away the plaques, we would at the very least arrest the progress of Alzheimer's and maybe even reverse it entirely. But that simply wasn't the case. We were able to find medications that, when we did trials on them, did fabulously at clearing away amyloid, and yet Alzheimer's still progressed. This caused researchers to go back and look at that initial data on amyloid plaques being causative, and they found some real holes in that initial research that had been covered up by these researchers. So we have to be careful not to make the same mistakes about reactive oxygen species, especially because even though these artificial sweeteners do seem to elevate them, that doesn't always correlate with cognitive decline. We've seen contradictory information when we look at human trials. There is a prospective observational study out of Brazil using their national health data that did look at artificial sweetener consumption and dementia and cognitive decline risk over time. It was a very long study, a very large study. The problem with it is that they didn't really look at factors like diet and other lifestyle factors when they were looking at this potentially causative mechanism. And it ended up giving us some kind of confusing data in that we did see an elevation in risk of cognitive decline and dementia in individuals consuming artificial sweeteners that did seem to be relative to the level of consumption, but it only persisted through age 60. And in individuals, once they passed age 60, we no longer saw that risk. And that should not be the case if it was actually causative. And there is a potential for what we call an unhealthy user bias here, in that when they went back and reanalyzed the data from that study, they also found that weight gain, obesity were much more common in those that were consuming artificial sweeteners, and that the weight gain seemed to increase with individuals who consume more. I doubt that the artificial sweeteners were causative in that either. And you probably had an issue where people who consumed more calories were much more likely to consume artificially sweetened beverages, whereas the healthier, more appropriate weight individuals tended to consume zero-calorie beverages like water, black coffee, and tea. As a result, we have to be very careful about making these sort of definitive conclusions, especially when there is contradictory data. And the handful of, I will grant you, small and not perfectly done randomized controlled trials that looked at artificial sweeteners mostly versus sugar sweetened beverages, the beverages with artificial sweeteners in those studies came out looking better for cognitive decline and dementia than the sugared sweetened beverages. We also have a lot of emerging research that is very suggestive that one of the major causative mechanisms in dementia and Alzheimer's may be insulin resistance, because we are finding that elevation in insulin resistance in the receptors that gate whether sugar can get into the brain from the blood circulatory system. These receptors, when they develop insulin resistance, seem to drive the processes that elevate these reactive oxygen species as well. And also will seem to develop processes that increase amyloid deposition, neurofibrillary tangles, and all the other things we see as Alzheimer's develops. This has led to a handful of researchers beginning to call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. This probably isn't fully accurate either, but it is compelling research and something we have to consider if we are trying to look for the cause of Alzheimer's. And certainly we have to be careful not to fully attribute it to artificial sweeteners when that simply may be a red herring. Okay, so another thing that Dr. Lustig talks about is the danger of ultra processed foods and what kind of foods we should be eating. In this, he again has a lot of very accurate and good information, but I also think he overstates some things that may cause folks to make some bad decisions relative to food. And we'll get into that after we watch this clip.
73% of the items in the American grocery store are poison. So if you go into the grocery store, you already have a problem.
So the first one is don't go hungry. The second one is to
stay on the outside of the
aisle.
Supermarket.
Yeah. Anything else for Jenny and Dave?
And most importantly, I don't want them to have to read food labels, because that's kind of, out of bounds. Okay. But they should basically, if a food has a label, it's a warning label. That's how they should look at it. Okay. And if any food has a sugar in the first three ingredients, it's dessert. That's how they should look at it. So, Chinese chicken salad is dessert.
In that clip, Dr. Lustig is talking about 73% of the food in American grocery stores being quote unquote poison. I think we got to be a little bit careful when we make these kind of statements, because it gives Americans the idea that they're not safe to really shop in a grocery store, and that's patently false. Something a pathology professor of mine in medical school used to like to say was the only difference between a drug and poison is the dose. And there's an extent to which that's true with some foods as well. And the problem with foods with added sugar that Dr. Lustig is very ready to talk about, and ultra-processed foods, is it can be very difficult to not overconsume these foods. And he's right that avoiding added sugar and avoiding ultra-processed foods is usually good, but it's not a universal thing. There are protein bars that have relatively low sugar content to their fiber content, and for the majority of people, you can eat these and get protein rather easily and quickly without causing you to consume too many calories and therefore have a problem. And if we really understand that it's a problem with the amount of calories we're taking in that causes most of the issues with ultra-processed foods, I think it gives us a little bit better picture. And yes, you are much better off overwhelmingly trying to consume whole foods that you prep yourself at home, and do not go out to a restaurant for. Certainly do not get from a fast food restaurant where there really is very little in the way of whole foods. And that we try and avoid sugar sweetened drinks and candy and candy bars and donuts and all these things with added sugar because it becomes exceedingly difficult not to overconsume them. But that is where I think I would go with recommendations for nutrition if I were talking to Jenny and Dave, as Dr. Lustig was attempting to in this clip. So I think that is important to say. I also want to comment on this next clip where Dr. Lustig talks about GLP-1 medications and items with added sugar.
And then finally, let me switch to my third hat, my public health advocate hat. Now, I did say these drugs work. 16% mean weight loss. True. Okay. If everyone in America who qualified for a GLP-1 analog got it, that would be $2.1 trillion to the healthcare system, which is currently $4.1 trillion. So that would be a 50% surcharge over what we're currently paying. And Medicare is going to go broke by the year 2029 anyway, without it. So you're going to put another 50% on top of that? How the hell are you going to pay for that for a 16% weight loss? Conversely, if we just got added sugar out of the diet, out of the American diet, to the level of USDA guidelines of 12 teaspoons of added sugar per day, no more, we could get a 29% weight loss and save $3.0 trillion. That's a $5.1 trillion swing for double the weight loss and no side effects. Which one do you think is better?
I largely think Dr. Lustig is correct in this clip in that viewing GLP-1 medications as a magic fix for obesity is a problem for a number of reasons. He mentions cost as being the primary problem with these medications. I think we also have to throw in side effects and tolerability. Both of them are an issue, and they can result in patients going on and coming off of these medications repeatedly. And we have solid research that yo-yoing your weight is worse than just gaining weight and keeping it on from the standpoint of cardiovascular risk and probably cancer risk as well. So I think he is right that we would be much better served by removing added sugar from the average American's diet. But this is something that is not easy to do. And for some people, GLP-1s can be a nice assist in getting that done. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater entirely. I'd also like to comment on the fact I think we need some creative government policy approaches and more creative nutrition approaches in the medical community to assist people in finding ways to take a little better control of their diet, to have healthy whole foods a little more affordable and more convenient to get, and to construct lifestyles in the United States that allow people time to be able to prep most of their meals themselves so that we don't see this sort of fast food culture. One of the things I also want to be clear on is that I think we need to be careful not to over vilify sugar as a nutrient. Sugar by itself really isn't problematic, and we've had studies showing an isocaloric, that means same calorie for calorie, substitution of sugar in the diet for protein can actually lead to healthier weights and better insulin resistance. So there's a lot of contradictory stuff here. And I think the real problem comes with the amount of added sugar in foods and how that encourages general overconsumption and hypercaloric diets. So it's not a simple issue, and trying to oversimplify the issue, I think, can confuse people and lead them to make bad choices. For instance, if you know there's sugar in fruits and you're going to avoid fruits because, oh, there's sugar in that, that can actually lead to dietary choices that are worse for you. Fiber is very healthy. Fruits contain fiber. And when you consume fiber with the sugars in fruits, it doesn't have the same sort of effect on encouraging overconsumption that, say, drinking sodas or eating candy bars would. So, anyways, I hope all of this information helps clarify and does not confuse. Be sure to let me know in the comments section if you still have questions about this material after my attempt at clarification here. And if any of the things brought up in these clips or that I talked about have led to some degree of confusion. And if you have found this helpful, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It is very helpful for me in getting this material out to more people and giving me the time and the resources to generate more content like this. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope to see you again on the Human Momentum Podcast channel.